Consumer sentiment in the United States just fell to 47.6, which is the lowest number ever recorded in the 75-year history of the University of Michigan survey. Lower than during the 2008 crash, lower than during the pandemic lockdowns, lower than during the worst stagflation of the 1970s, lower than after September 11th, lower than any moment of fear, crisis, or despair that Americans have collectively experienced since the Korean War. And that number was recorded before the ceasefire collapsed, before the Islamabad talks failed, before the naval blockade was declared, before the IMF issued its recession warning 2 days ago. That number represents how Americans felt when they still believed the worst might be over. Imagine what the next reading looks like now that they know it is not. And if you are watching this right now and you feel like something has broken in this country, something beyond the economy, beyond the politics, beyond the inflation and the war and the cost of groceries, something in the actual psychological fabric of the people around you, I need you to understand that you are not imagining it. You are observing it accurately, because the data confirms what your instincts are telling you. Anxiety and depression among American adults rose 9.3% and 10.6% respectively between 2025 and 2026, according to Rula's State of Mental Health report published yesterday. Emergency room visits for mental health crises are up 30% since 2024. 84% of American employees reported facing at least one mental health challenge in the past year, with 57% experiencing moderate to high levels of burnout. At least 50% of U.S. employees are currently quiet quitting, which is a behavioral signal of chronic emotional disengagement. More than half of all American adults feel isolated, left out, and stressed by societal division, according to the American Psychological Association. Targeted political violence grew by more than 30% from 2024 to 2025, according to START. Threats against members of Congress surged 58%, according to the U.S. Capitol Police. Road rage shootings have increased by an average of 23% every year for a decade. And the number of people shot in road rage incidents surged more than 400% between 2014 and 2023. And 134 mass shootings have occurred in the United States so far in 2026, killing 147 people and wounding 529 as of April 30th. Something has snapped, and what comes next is going to be ugly. Because every single pressure that is driving this psychological collapse is getting worse, not better. And America is not prepared for what a population at the breaking point actually does when the next round of bad news arrives. And I want to speak directly to you for a moment. If you are over 50 and watching this, I want you to think about something. Think about the last time you were in a grocery store and someone snapped at a cashier over a price. Think about the last time you were driving and someone behind you honked within a fraction of a second of the light turning green, as if that half second was the thing that was going to push them over the edge. Think about the last time you heard a neighbor or a coworker or a family member say something so raw, so angry, so unlike the person you thought you knew, that it stopped you mid-conversation. Think about your own moments. The nights where the anxiety about money or health or the state of the country kept you staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. The mornings where the thought of checking the news felt physically heavy. The moments where you caught yourself feeling a level of frustration that was disproportionate to whatever triggered it. And you realized the frustration was not about the trigger. It was about everything all at once, with nowhere to put it. That is what is happening to 330 million people simultaneously. And I am going to show you the data that proves it. Rage is now America's default emotional state, and it is showing up everywhere from highways to hospitals to Congress. You can feel it in traffic. You can feel it in the grocery store when someone reaches past you for the last affordable cut of beef. You can feel it in the waiting room when the receptionist tells you the doctor is running 2 hours behind. You can feel it in the comments section of every local news article about housing costs, about gas prices, about school closings, about police shootings. America is angry, not politically angry, not ideologically angry. Viscerally, physically. Existentially angry in the way that a trapped animal becomes angry when the cage gets smaller and the food gets less, and there is no visible way out. The American Automobile Association documented that 82% of Americans committed an act of road rage in the past year. 82%, that is not a fringe behavior, that is a national condition. The Trace, a nonprofit news organization focused on gun violence, found that between 2014 and 2023, the number of people shot in road rage incidents surged more than 400%, from 92 victims to 481. Road rage shooting deaths doubled from 70 in 2018 to 141 in 2022. More than 200 murders and 12,000 injuries were attributed to road rage over a 7-year period, according to AAA. And states that do not require gun permits experience nearly triple the rate of road rage shooting victimization compared to states that do. A 6-year-old boy named Aiden Leos was shot and killed on his way to kindergarten in his mother's car after a road rage incident on the 55 freeway in Orange County, California. A child on a highway because someone was angry, and that anger is not confined to the roads. Hospital workers report a surge in assaults by patients and family members. Retail workers face escalating verbal and physical abuse from customers stressed about prices. Airline incidents involving unruly passengers have remained at elevated levels since the pandemic. Teachers are leaving the profession in record numbers, citing not just low pay, but the hostility of parents, school boards, and students. Local elected officials, the people who manage your water, your roads, your zoning, are being threatened at rates that Princeton's Bridging Divides initiative documented as historically unprecedented. Nearly 75% of all local officials reported being less willing to work on controversial issues or run for higher office because of the threats they receive. The R Street Institute published an analysis concluding that what America is experiencing is not political violence in the traditional sense, but rather rage against society itself, driven by alienation, instability, psychological distress, and a desire to be seen rather than any coherent belief or cause. The FBI has introduced a new classification, nihilistic violent extremist, to describe actors who pursue chaos or fame rather than ideology. That classification did not exist 5 years ago. It exists now because the pattern of violence has changed. People are not attacking for a reason. They are attacking because they have reached the end of something inside themselves, and the attack is the only expression of despair they have left. Burnout has eaten the American workforce from the inside, and nobody can afford to quit or stay. Favor Mental Health Services published a 2026 analysis showing that 84% of American employees faced at least one mental health challenge in the past year. 57% experienced moderate to high levels of burnout, and at least 50% of the U.S. workforce is currently quiet quitting, which in clinical terms means they are present at work but emotionally, cognitively, and motivationally disengaged. They show up, they do the minimum, they go home, they feel nothing about the work and increasingly nothing about much else. And the economic impact of this collective psychological withdrawal is staggering. Depression and anxiety alone are estimated to cost the global economy $1 trillion per year in lost productivity, much of it driven by what researchers call presenteeism, the act of working while mentally unwell. The American worker in 2026 is caught in a trap that has no exit. The cost of living has risen 26 to 36% cumulatively since 2020, depending on the category. Wages have not kept pace. Quitting means losing income that is already insufficient but irreplaceable. Staying means enduring a workplace where labor shortages have forced employees to absorb unmanageable workloads because the positions that should exist alongside theirs are unfilled, and the company has decided that the productivity of the surviving employees will cover the gap. It does not cover the gap, it covers the spreadsheet. The gap is absorbed by the human being who goes home at 7 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. Skips the gym, eats fast food because there is no time to cook. Sleeps poorly because the anxiety follows them to bed, wakes up at 5:30 a.m. and does it again. And Rula's 2026 report found that financial stress is not just a contributor to the mental health crisis. It is a barrier to treatment. The people who most need therapy cannot afford it. The people who can afford it cannot get an appointment because waitlists are months long. And the people who have insurance that covers mental health still face copays, deductibles, and prior authorization barriers that make consistent treatment functionally inaccessible for a working person who cannot take time off. 11% of Americans cited the poor economy as a direct cause of their anxiety. But the real number is almost certainly higher because economic stress does not announce itself as the cause of the insomnia. The irritability, the chest tightness, the short temper with the children, the fights with the spouse, the third drink at 9 p.m. that used to be occasional and is now nightly. Financial despair wears 100 different disguises and none of them say, "I cannot afford to live" on the label. And the healthcare system that is supposed to treat the mental health crisis is itself in crisis. Health Affairs Scholar published a study documenting that younger adults, individuals with low incomes, and those facing housing instability carry the greatest burden of mental health crisis. These are the exact populations that have the least access to care. Community mental health centers have seen their federal funding frozen or cut. Therapist waitlists in major metropolitan areas exceed 4 months. Rural counties have 0 practicing psychiatrists. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline receives more calls every quarter. And the crisis counselors answering those calls are themselves burning out at rates that threaten the viability of the service. And the Medicaid work requirements arriving in December will strip healthcare coverage from millions of people who are currently using Medicaid to access mental health treatment. Not just therapy, psychiatric medication. The antidepressants, the anti-anxiety medications, the mood stabilizers. The antipsychotics that millions of Americans depend on to maintain the baseline level of psychological functioning that allows them to work, to parent, to drive, to exist in society without hurting themselves or someone else. When those medications become unaffordable because the insurance that covered them has been terminated, the withdrawal is not just emotional. It is neurochemical. Abrupt discontinuation of SSRIs produces physical withdrawal symptoms including dizziness, nausea, insomnia, electric shock sensations, and rebound depression that can be more severe than the original condition. And there is no plan at any level of government to manage what happens when millions of Americans simultaneously lose access to the psychiatric medications that are currently keeping them stable. Political violence has escalated to levels not seen since the 1970s, and the midterm election will make it worse. Princeton's Bridging Divides Initiative released a report documenting that targeted political violence in the United States grew by more than 30% from 2024 to 2025. That is not a historical comparison to the 1860s or the 1960s. That is a one-year increase measured in the most recent data available. Threats and harassment against members of Congress surged 58% according to the U.S. Capitol Police. And BDI documented multiple spikes in threats against local officials throughout 2025, with the year's largest spike in September following the assassination of conservative political activist Charlie Kirk. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published a paper reporting that 3 times more violent political acts and plots had been carried out since 2016 than in the preceding 25 years. Approximately 300 acts of political violence occurred in the United States between the January 6th attack and the 2024 election, the largest sustained surge since the domestic terrorism era of the 1970s. And 2026 has already produced an escalation beyond what 2025 documented. Federal immigration agents fatally shot Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis, triggering nationwide protests. The FBI raided a Georgia election facility ahead of the midterms. A Kimberly-Clark warehouse was set on fire in an arson reportedly motivated by anti-capitalist sentiment and labor grievances, causing an estimated $600 million in property damage. Threats against local officials have continued to climb, with women and Democratic officials reporting statistically significant increases in negative impacts on both their professional and personal lives. And the November 2026 midterm election is going to intensify every one of these dynamics because midterms in a high-stress environment become the focal point for every grievance, every frustration, every conspiracy theory, and every displaced rage that has been accumulating since the last election. Affordability will be the central issue. But the anger surrounding the issue will not be expressed through polite town halls and respectful candidate debates. It will be expressed through threats, through protests, through confrontations at polling locations, through violence against campaign workers, through online radicalization of people who were already at the breaking point before the election season began. And the political system has no mechanism for de-escalating a population that is simultaneously economically desperate. psychologically depleted, socially isolated, and armed with more than 400 million civilian-owned firearms. More guns were manufactured for the American market in 2021 and 2022 than in any two-year period in history. Over 42 million guns entered civilian circulation in those 2 years alone. And when psychological distress combines with economic desperation and easy access to firearms, the result is not a policy debate. The result is what America is already experiencing. Road rage shootings up 400%. Mass shootings at 134 in the first 4 months of the year. Political assassinations. Workplace arson. Threats against every level of government from Congress to the local school board. And the pattern is accelerating, and the acceleration correlates directly with the economic data. The months with the highest spikes in political violence and threats corresponded with the months of worst inflation data, worst consumer confidence, and worst affordability reports. The connection is not coincidental, it is causal. When people cannot afford to live, they do not respond with calm policy analysis. They respond with rage, and the rage finds targets. Sometimes those targets are political. Sometimes they are random, sometimes they are the people closest to them. Domestic violence calls have risen in every major metropolitan area since the war-driven inflation began in March. Substance abuse treatment admissions are climbing, DUI arrests have increased. Emergency psychiatric holds are up. Every indicator of a society that is losing its ability to regulate itself is flashing red simultaneously. And the indicators that are supposed to signal hope, wage growth, GDP expansion, low unemployment, are being cited by the same officials who are cutting the safety net, fueling the war and adding trillions to the debt. The good numbers are real, and they are irrelevant because they describe an economy. And the crisis is not economic, the crisis is human. Isolation has turned half of America into strangers in their own communities, and loneliness is now a public health emergency. Former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy declared loneliness and social isolation a public health epidemic in America. Not a concern, not a trend, an epidemic, and the data justifies the language. More than half of all American adults feel isolated, left out, and stressed by societal division, according to the American Psychological Association's 2025 Stress in America survey. A quarter of adults, 26%, are not sure or do not believe they will ever achieve their dreams or goals in life. More than 4 in 5, 85%, cited obstacles standing in their way. And the APA noted that the deterioration in social connection is not evenly distributed. It falls hardest on young adults, on men, on low-income households, and on people in rural communities where the physical infrastructure of connection, the churches, the community centers, the local businesses where people gathered, has been hollowed out by decades of economic decline. And isolation does not just make people sad, it makes them dangerous. The FBI's new classification of nihilistic violent extremist exists specifically because the agency recognized that an increasing number of violent actors are not motivated by ideology. They are motivated by despair, by a desire for visibility, by the absence of any connection to a community that would give them a reason not to act on their worst impulses. The R Street Institute analysis made this explicit. The through-line in recent American violence is not a political agenda. It is alienation, it is instability. It is psychological distress so profound that the violent act becomes, in the mind of the perpetrators, the only way to be seen by a society that has otherwise made them invisible. Thomas Matthew Crooks, who attempted to assassinate a former president, left no manifesto and had no known ties to any extremist organization. His online posts hinted at a desire for visibility rather than any political cause. The violence is increasingly purposeless. And purposeless violence is harder to predict, harder to prevent, and harder to contain than ideologically motivated violence because there is no ideology to monitor, no organization to infiltrate, no network to disrupt. There is only a person who has reached the end of their ability to cope with a life that has become unbearable. In a society that has become indifferent, in an economy that has become impossible, surrounded by 400 million guns, and the generation that should be building families and communities and civic institutions, Americans in their 20s and 30s, is instead the most anxious and isolated generation ever measured. The Rula report documented that Gen Z reports the highest rates of anxiety of any generation, with 11% citing the poor economy as a direct cause. But the isolation is not only a young person's crisis. Americans over 50 are experiencing it at rates that have doubled since before the pandemic. Retirement communities that used to function as social networks have seen participation decline. Church attendance, which was the primary social structure for older Americans in rural communities, has dropped precipitously. Volunteer organizations that provided purpose and connection for retirees have lost membership. And the digital replacement for in-person connection, social media, has been documented by multiple studies to worsen loneliness rather than alleviate it, particularly for older adults who use it primarily as a passive consumption tool rather than an active social engagement platform. You are sitting alone in your house, scrolling through news that makes you angrier and more afraid with every headline. And the algorithm is feeding you more of the same because outrage drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. You are being monetized for your despair, and the lonelier you feel, the more you scroll. And the more you scroll, the lonelier you feel. And the loop continues until the person sitting in that chair is no longer the person their family recognizes. Until the patience is gone, until the kindness is gone. Until the ability to believe that things will get better is gone. And what remains is a human being who is functionally depleted, and one piece of bad news away from a reaction that surprises even themselves. Economic despair and psychological collapse are feeding each other in a loop that nobody in Washington is willing to name. Every economic crisis in American history has produced a corresponding mental health crisis. The Great Depression saw suicide rates climb 22%. The 2008 financial crisis produced a documented spike in anxiety disorders, substance abuse, and domestic violence. The pandemic triggered the most acute mental health deterioration in the history of modern measurement. And the current economic environment, which combines the affordability crisis of the pandemic era with an active war, an energy shock, collapsing consumer confidence, rising inflation, stagnant wages, record credit card delinquencies, and the threat of recession, is producing a psychological crisis that is measurably worse than any of those predecessors by the data. Consumer sentiment at 47.6 is worse than 2008. Anxiety and depression rates rising 9 to 10% in a single year is worse than the annual increases during the pandemic. Burnout at 57% of the workforce is worse than the burnout levels documented during the Great Resignation of 2021 and 2022. And the feedback loop between economic despair and psychological collapse is self-reinforcing. A person who is anxious about money sleeps worse, which impairs their cognitive function, which reduces their productivity at work, which jeopardizes their employment, which increases their financial anxiety. A person who is depressed by the feeling of falling behind stops opening their bills, stops checking their bank balance, stops contributing to their 401k, stops planning for the future, because the future has become a source of dread rather than hope. A person who is burned out by a workplace that demands more hours for wages that buy less stops engaging with their community, stops volunteering, stops attending church, stops calling friends, and retreats into the isolation that the Surgeon General identified as an epidemic, and the APA confirmed affects more than half of American adults. Each withdrawal makes the next one easier. Each retreating person reduces the connective tissue of the community by one thread. And when enough threads are pulled, the fabric tears. And what emerges through the tear is the rage, the road rage, the mass shootings, the workplace arson, the political threats, the nihilistic violence, the epidemic of despair that is visible in every data set I have cited in this video and invisible in every economic report that measures GDP growth and unemployment rates and calls the economy strong. The economy is not strong. The economy is producing a psychological collapse that is expressing itself through violence, isolation, disengagement, substance abuse, chronic illness, shortened lifespans, and a pervasive bone-deep exhaustion that has settled over this country like a fog. And the fog does not lift because the conditions producing it are not improving. They are worsening, inflation is rising again, the war is not over. The ceasefire was a lie, tariffs may return in July. The debt ceiling will be hit in August, Medicaid work requirements arrive by June. SNAP cuts are coming, housing is unaffordable, healthcare is unaffordable. Childcare is unaffordable. And the next University of Michigan consumer sentiment reading, when it comes, will almost certainly set another record low. Because the American public has absorbed more simultaneous economic, social, and psychological stress in the past 6 months than at any comparable period in the modern era. And the coping mechanisms, the savings, the credit capacity, the community support, the mental health infrastructure, the social safety net, that were supposed to absorb that stress have been depleted, underfunded, cut, or dismantled. There is nothing left between the population and the full weight of what is happening. And when there is nothing left, people break. Some break quietly, some break loudly. But they break, and this country is about to find out what 330 million people breaking at the same time actually looks like. Share this video not for the algorithm, because the person you share it with may be one of the people who is breaking right now and does not know that what they are feeling is not personal failure. It is a national crisis, and naming it is the first step towards surviving it. And if this video made you feel something, if it named something you have been carrying for months that you could not articulate, I want you to know that the feeling is real, the data confirms it. And the fact that you are still here, still watching, still paying attention, still trying to understand what is happening, means you have not broken. You are bent, everyone is bent right now, but you are still here. And the person you share this video with might need to hear that more than you realize. Because the most dangerous moment in a psychological crisis is not when the crisis begins. It is when the person in crisis believes they are the only one experiencing it. When they believe their inability to cope is a personal failure rather than a rational response to an irrational situation. When they believe that everyone else is handling it and they alone are falling apart. That belief is the lie that isolation tells. And the truth that every data point in this video demonstrates, is that no one is handling it. Not the 84% of employees with mental health challenges. Not the 82% committing road rage. Not the 57% burning out at work. Not the 50% who have quietly quit. Not the more than half of all adults who feel isolated and divided. Not the consumers whose confidence is at a 75-year low. Nobody is handling it. And admitting that is not weakness. It is the beginning of a response that is more honest and more productive than the pretense that everything is fine. Everything is not fine, America is losing it. And the only question is whether we lose it alone, in isolation, in silence, in 330 million private collapses that nobody names, or whether we lose it together. Out loud. In a shared acknowledgement that the system has pushed human beings past the point that human beings were designed to endure. And that something fundamental has to change before the breaking becomes permanent. Share this video not for the views, for the person who needs to know they are not alone.